On Plugged In, it's been 1 year of life and death in the COVID pandemic, but an end is in sight.
We're now on track to have enough vaccine supply for every adult in America by the end of May.
With more shots going into more arms, what will happen with the virus?
6 months to a year from now, once almost everyone has had either a vaccination or a first infection, I think that we could likely get back to something resembling normal life, whatever that is.
The lessons learned from all over the world and a peek into how we live with COVID on Plugged In, the pandemic year. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. 1 year ago, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic for the novel coronavirus COVID-19. Since then, more than 150 million cases have been recorded, and more than 2.5 million people have died. The United States has had more reported infections than the top 3 countries combined, and the U.S. has had more than 500,000 people who have died from the virus. Since taking office, President Joe Biden has prioritized ending the pandemic, promising that by the end of May, a vaccination shot for every American who wants one. VOA's Steve Baragona has covered the pandemic since the beginning. Today, he is looking ahead to how this might end.
After a year of empty streets and full hospitals in much of the U.S., the beginning of the end is in sight.
But I think by the fall, unless there's something very bad with variants that comes along, we're going to see sporting events in person, we're going to see social events, movies, theater, restaurants and bars.
Vaccinations are speeding up. A third vaccine is online from Johnson & Johnson, and a rival company, Merck, will help increase supplies in a deal brokered by President Joe Biden's administration.
We're now on track to have enough vaccine supply for every adult in America by the end of May.
We'll have an oversupply, and I suspect that by the summer, we'll start to be donating our doses to low and middle income countries.
Gustin says it's in the interest of wealthy countries to make sure lower income countries get vaccinated. Dangerous variants can appear anywhere the virus is spreading. They could slow the return to normal. Some are already weakening the vaccines. The shots still look effective, but new variants will keep evolving.
They're essentially a shot across the bow, telling us that this virus is sneaky and it has the ability to evade our defenses.
Another thing that could slow the return to normal? Relaxing control measures too soon, says University of Washington epidemiologist Ali Muqdad.
We made the same mistake last year, remember, and we have to be very careful right now. We should not repeat the same mistake, especially at a time where we know there are more variants coming up.
And yet, several states are doing just that. Texas Governor Greg Abbott.
All businesses of any type are allowed to open 100%. Also, I am ending the statewide mask mandate.
Biden called the move Neanderthal thinking.
I think it's a big mistake. Look, I hope everybody's realized by now, these masks make a difference.
In the long term, the biggest problem may be people who do not trust the vaccines. Surveys say that's about a quarter of Americans, a third of people in 6 African countries, and 79% in Lebanon, to name a few.
There is deep hesitancy. I think people will get less hesitant as they see this working and they see their neighbors and family members getting vaccinated. But there will be a small group of people who don't want the vaccine.
That sets the stage for flare-ups down the road. Ultimately, COVID-19 may be here to stay, so an annual COVID shot may be too. Experts say that means many more countries need vaccine manufacturing plants, so the world is not stuck again with shots for rich countries while everyone else is left behind. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
In Britain, students are now going back to school as part of the UK's plan to lift all COVID restrictions by June. In Italy, people over the age of 65 are now approved for the AstraZeneca vaccine. European countries had hoped their well-funded healthcare systems would offer some protection, but the continent was one of COVID's early targets, and it still faces high infection rates. From London, here is VOA's Henry Ridgewell on Europe's pandemic year.
Codogno in northern Italy still bears the scars of its unwanted fame, the epicentre of Europe's first coronavirus outbreak. On February 20th last year, a 38-year-old was admitted to the hospital with breathing problems. He was diagnosed with the virus the following day. Head doctor Francesco Tursi recalls the horror that unfolded.
Ne arrivano due, ne arrivano tre.
We heard about 1, 2, 3 cases, and we were immediately submerged with patients with serious breathing problems. They couldn't breathe. We didn't even have time to think. This literally changed our lives.
Tursi himself caught the virus days later and spent a month in the hospital. As cases multiplied, northern Italy went into lockdown. It was too little, too late. In the following days, several European countries reported new cases. By the time the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on March 11th, Spain, France, and several other European states had imposed lockdowns. But Britain held off, delaying its lockdown for 2 more weeks against scientific advice.
Had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half.
Britain would suffer the highest coronavirus death toll in Europe in 2020. Its economy was also among the worst hit, shrinking by 10%.
The UK is really a great example of this notion that when you try to choose between public health or the economy, you lose both.
In Turkey, doctors accused the government of trying to hide the true scale of the pandemic as hospitals filled with patients. Russia was also accused of a cover-up, with doctors claiming the true death toll was likely 3 times higher than the official total of 57,000 deaths in 2020. As lockdowns continued into the summer, governments across Europe pumped billions into their economies to try to keep businesses afloat and people in jobs. Public debt soared. But as a bleak 2020 drew to a close, science offered hope. Medical trials showed that several vaccines offered remarkable protection against COVID-19, with Britain the first Western country to roll out a mass vaccination program.
We cannot underestimate the scale of achievement that this has been, to go from the identification of a new virus and sequence it only in January of 2020 to 11 months later having a number of safe and extraordinarily effective vaccines.
Dangers lurk ahead. Infections remain high, and there are fears over new, more resistant strains of the virus circulating in Europe. Back in Codogno, Dr. Tursi is still treating coronavirus patients. Like hundreds of thousands of other frontline workers, Tursi risked his life to help others survive. The pandemic has changed life in countless ways, and it's not over yet. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
The U.S. is pledging $4 billion to help distribute COVID-19 vaccines to developing nations. A new variant of the virus has led to high infection and death rates in South Africa and neighboring countries. From Johannesburg, VOA's Anita Powell reports on Africa's challenges of the pandemic year.
What a difference a year makes in the life of a pandemic. But in Africa, what a difference a week makes. In recent weeks, as Africa prepared to mark the milestone of a year since the virus made landfall, millions of long-awaited vaccine doses finally began to rain upon the continent. Many were provided by the global COVAX facility, which provides vaccines to lower-income countries. That, officials say, has flipped this tale from one of despair to one of hope. And, says South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, Africa had a hand in turning the tide.
South Africa's scientists and research institutions have made an important contribution to these efforts and have contributed to global knowledge about the disease, including on the emergence of new variants. And in this regard, our scientists, who we should be proud of, have really led the way, and they are recognized globally.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa, officials this month received their first delivery of 1.7 million vaccines through COVAX. Village Reach, an aid organization that focuses on remote, rural, low-income countries, has been working to help that population. Their DRC country director told VOA that while African nations appear to have a lower proportion of confirmed cases and deaths, the pandemic has still hit hard here.
Africa, yes, we are also affected as the rest of the world in different proportion, but we have to continue to protect ourselves through all the protective measures, but also we have to get vaccinated so that we are all protected.
Dr. Richard Lessels, one of South Africa's top viral researchers, says the continent's largest vaccine drive, in South Africa, looks promising after fits and starts. Last month, South African authorities suddenly reversed course after receiving 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which researchers found to be less effective against the new variant that accounts for the majority of the nation's new cases. South Africa quickly switched to the Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, but the process still delayed the vaccination campaign. Lessels says that as the continent stares down this anniversary, it means one thing: time.
I think only time will tell once we get beyond that first priority group of the healthcare workers and start delivering it to the other vulnerable groups within the population. We'll then get a much better sense of how we're doing here in South Africa.
So what is year 2 of the pandemic going to look like in Africa? On this, everyone seems to agree. Busy. Anita Powell, VOA News, Johannesburg.
As vaccinations ramp up, experts studying COVID-19 are taking what they have learned about the virus to model its behavior in the weeks and months, even years ahead. Jennie Lavine is an infectious disease researcher at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I asked her about what living with COVID might look like.
Of course, there's a lot of unknowns because this is a new beast in the human population. But we do live with some of its very close relatives, which are endemic coronaviruses. And so we've been looking to them to try to understand what this might look like, what COVID-19 might look like when it becomes endemic. So when it's no longer in this phase where we're having a giant outbreak, where everyone, tons and tons of people are getting infected in a very short span of time. And so we've been looking at these 4 human coronaviruses that circulate endemically. And interestingly, they just cause a mild cold in the vast majority of people. And so we've been trying to understand, how does that relate to what is happening with this, the massive hospitalizations and deaths with COVID-19? And is it possible that that's what COVID-19 will look like in the future?
Well, we've got a number of vaccines, and we seem to be marching forward to trying to get this behind it. We've got a huge road ahead of us, and everyone has some level, or not everyone, but a lot of people have some level of optimism. Is there something that you're a little bit concerned about? Is there something sort of on your radar screen that worries you?
Yeah, there is. I think what we're seeing right now, we're sort of starting to see the first evidence of what happens in populations where a lot of people have immunity. And so I think all of these sort of predictions that we've been talking about in the past few minutes, many of which are fairly optimistic, that maybe this could just turn into another common cold, which would be fantastic and does seem plausible. It really relies on the idea that 1 or 2 infections or 1 or 2 doses of vaccine will lead to really long-lasting disease-reducing immunity. It doesn't have to have such strong immunity that it blocks transmission, but it does really have to reduce disease for a long time.
Is there any explanation as to why, if you even know, is that why children, at least right now, seem less likely to get COVID? Is there any explanation for that?
We don't know. It seems like they may be somewhat less likely to get it. And it's very clear that if they get it, they're way less likely to get a severe case, which is really promising in the long term. But we don't know why. We really just don't know. It's one of those mysteries. There's a group in New York City who looks at age effects of on the immune system and how different aged people respond to these viruses, and they're doing some work to try to figure it out, but we don't know.
It's so easy to look at things with 2020, and the world looks at SARS-CoV-2, and we now see the devastating effect of it. Should we have seen it coming so that we could have headed it off more at the pass instead of basically making it easier to spread around the world? And is there a SARS-CoV-3 on the horizon? Or do you fear one?
Yeah. I think we're learning a lot of lessons about, pandemic preparedness right now. I think that there are characteristics of SARS-CoV-2, of COVID-19, that are different and made it harder for the world to contain it than SARS-CoV-1. And a lot of that has to do with what we were talking about before of how transmissible it is. That said, there are countries that have done a really, really good job of containing it. And in containing it, they not only prevented infections and hospitalizations and deaths in their country, they gave the virus a little bit less room to develop these variants before we could get vaccines out. So I think it's a hard bug, and it would have been hard under any circumstances. I also think that I hope that the world, as a global community, we've learned some lessons about the importance of early containment.
Do you want to go out on a limb and sort of guess when we can predict when we can get back to normal, or is that an impossibility?
I think if a dose or two of vaccine or an infection or two prevents severe disease, even if it allows for transmission like we were just talking about, if it prevents severe disease for a long time, then 6 months to a year from now, once almost everyone has had either a vaccination or a first infection, I think that we could likely get back to something resembling normal life, whatever that is.
Whatever that means. Well, that sounds like a little light at the end of the tunnel, and thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Several weeks before the pandemic was declared on March 11, 2020, COVID-19 spread from China to the Middle East. It was deadliest in Iran, and the virus's spread only made the region's existing crises worse. VOA's Henry Ridgewell has the story of the pandemic year in the Middle East.
Iran recorded its first coronavirus infections in February 2020, one of the first outbreaks outside China. Within days, it had become a global epicenter. Government figures suggest 60,000 people have died since the outbreak began, but the true number is likely far higher. Critics say early mistakes by the government cost lives.
You saw them first deny it, then downplay it. The challenge is that the health and welfare of its own people is not priority number one. And when you're facing a global pandemic, that means your citizens are going to bear the brunt of it.
By the time the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on March 11th, the outbreak had spread across the Middle East. In Yemen and Syria, countries racked by deep-rooted conflicts, the pandemic compounded the pressure on fragile health systems. In May, the United Nations warned that the Yemeni health system had collapsed.
When there was a spike in deaths because of the coronavirus and other diseases, the workers were not able to keep up with the digging, the burial and finishing of the graves.
The festival of Eid al-Fitr in May, the end of Ramadan, was marked with somber, socially distanced worship across the Muslim world. In Lebanon, economic and political crises compounded by the pandemic and exacerbated by the August explosion in Beirut port pushed the country to the brink. By September, there were worsening outbreaks in several refugee camps in Yemen, Syria, Iraq and Lebanon. As third waves of the pandemic gripped Europe, the United States and Latin America at the end of 2020, the Middle East fared better than many feared. But the World Health Organization warns the situation remains precarious.
In our region, where people and healthcare institutions suffer constantly with war, natural disasters and disease, this virus has demanded all our efforts.
That effort is now being directed towards vaccinations. Israel has rolled out the fastest mass vaccination program in the world. Over half the population has received a first dose.
Number one, they did some things right in terms of purchasing agreements and getting early access to the vaccines. But really, this is all about operations and organization.
Vaccination rates vary sharply across the Middle East. In the occupied West Bank and Gaza, vaccination rates lag far behind those in Israel. The United Nations says Israel should provide vaccines. The Israeli government says healthcare is the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. Many countries in the region are using Chinese and Russian-made vaccines and are hoping to benefit from the global COVAX facility, which provides vaccines to poorer nations. The danger is not over. The World Health Organization says new strains of the virus are circulating in the region, which could be more infectious and resistant to vaccines. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News.
Scientists and doctors have been describing COVID-19 as a novel coronavirus. Novel meaning that it's new and attacking people in ways never seen before from a coronavirus. VOA health correspondent Carol Pearson explains what medical experts have discovered and are still mystified about in the pandemic year.
COVID-19 is a respiratory disease caused by a virus, officially known as SARS-CoV-2, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. It's the second time a coronavirus has sickened people and caused death. SARS first appeared in China in November 2002. The current version of the virus emerged from China in 2019, which is why it's called COVID-19. The virus invades the lungs. It multiplies and neutralizes the molecules that help us fight infection. Most people recover, but the virus can damage the lungs and leave patients gasping for air. Thomas Steele needed a double lung transplant because of COVID.
It's nothing like sitting in your hospital room gasping for every breath of air you take, and I did that for 58 days.
The lungs pass oxygen into the bloodstream, and the virus can damage the lungs and make the oxygen levels fall. Patients may need to be put on a ventilator to help them breathe. COVID-19 can also cause dangerous clotting in the bloodstream. People who already have damaged blood vessels from high blood pressure or stroke, and those with heart disease have a higher risk of serious disease. These clots can form throughout the body, including in the lungs and the heart. The clotting can cause heart attack or stroke. Dr. Alan Anderson is one of many cardiologists who saw people with healthy hearts suffer heart damage.
They had elevations of blood enzyme markers that were consistent with a heart attack, even though they didn't have any blockages in their coronary arteries. They had heart rhythm disturbances, and that this occurred with quite high prevalence.
The virus and the inflammation that accompanies it can damage the heart tissue, and some of the damage can be reversed, but some cannot. Doctors have also learned that the virus can damage another vital organ, the kidneys. A large New York medical system looked at more than 5,000 COVID patients last year. Their findings?
Of the 5,449 patients, 36.6% of them developed acute renal failure or kidney injury. Of the ones that got kidney injury, 14% required dialysis.
Scientists are still studying the impact of COVID-19 on the body, but the most severe effects start with the lungs. Damaged lungs have a harder time getting oxygen to the bloodstream, and organs need oxygen to function. If there is none, they can fail. The lungs, the heart, the kidneys, and the liver. And then there are the long-term consequences of the disease. Some are not life-threatening, but can affect the quality of life. Symptoms may include persistent fatigue, headache, shortness of breath, or chest pain. Others may experience brain fog or memory issues, and still others have lingering feelings of anxiety and depression. Anyone, not just those who are hospitalized, can have long-term symptoms, and there's no way to tell who will be affected.
We don't really know right now how many patients will develop these long COVID symptoms after they have had this infection. Studies look at anywhere between 10% and 80%. So there could be a large number of people who are experiencing symptoms well after, again, that 4-week time period when we expect people to normally recover.
Some medical centers have started special clinics to treat the long haulers, people whose symptoms persist even after they have recovered from COVID. Others may not be long haulers, but their lives have changed drastically because of COVID-19.
I'll never be the same person for the rest of my life.
He is one of many who will never be the same because of COVID-19. Carol Pearson, VOA News.
Lockdown orders and social distancing created a sudden shift in the world's work habits. While many essential workers had to report to workplaces, many others were able to work from home. With the freedom to choose where to live and work, Keith Kosinski reports from New York City.
Ancrum, New York, is a small farming town of about 1,500 people, 2 hours north of New York City. It may not be the first place one would expect to find international supermodel Saskia de Brouw, Dutch photographer and filmmaker Vincent van den Wegaard, and their 4-year-old daughter Luna. But
life is pretty good here. I mean, there's space. You get great produce. So the quality of life is quite amazing.
It's not where they expected to be, and it's a stark contrast from their apartment in Brooklyn, New York.
It was a great life. We had everything well organized. My daughter went to school not too far away, and there were friends to see, and just a lovely neighborhood.
However, the coronavirus pandemic changed that.
We thought it would be all quickly a thing of the past, the pandemic, and it wasn't.
As the infection spread through New York and the family was confined to their apartment, they looked beyond the city and bought this small home in this rural part of the state before they had even seen it in person.
We did notice a large body of New Yorkers take this opportunity to find solitude in another area where they had space, where they weren't on top of other people, so that they could at least protect themselves and their families.
At the same time, home prices in New York City dropped by 15 to 20% because of the pandemic, allowing people with lower income levels to move into some of the most affluent Manhattan neighborhoods.
Rents have come down in a way that actually has eased some of the affordability crisis.
The average salary in those high-end neighborhoods has dropped from $140,000 to $82,000 a year, and economists say the income of the new arrivals is around 40% less than those who are leaving the city. Yet, many expect residents will return to New York and other cities as the pandemic wanes, lured by the lower prices.
While the balance has shifted somewhat, to describe it as an urban exodus is clearly an exaggeration.
Real estate agents say the availability of COVID vaccines is already having an impact on the housing market.
I'm noticing people are ready to come back to New York. They are seeing this as an opportunity, those that are in the position, in the buyer's position, to find and grab a really good deal right now.
While Vincent and Saskia are not ready to give up living in the country, they are also feeling the pull of Brooklyn.
We also feel like the city has something really special to offer. And I think after 6 months being upstate, we kind of started missing it.
Keith Kosinski for VOA News, New York.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guest, infectious disease expert Jennie Lavine. And stay up to date on the COVID pandemic and the latest news at voanews.com. And please follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.